Between 1872 and 1891, 17 men disappeared without a trace across 3 counties in eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. They vanished from their homes, from forest roads, from town squares in broad daylight. No bodies were ever recovered. No ransom demands were made. The only connection between these men was something the authorities refused to document in official records. Each victim had been involved in violent land seizures against Melungeon families during the previous 3 decades. Local newspapers barely mentioned the disappearances, and county sheriffs closed investigations within weeks, citing lack of evidence. But in the isolated valleys of Newman's Ridge, whispers spoke of something else entirely. A reckoning that had been planned with the patience of mountain stone, executed with surgical precision, and hidden behind a wall of silence that even death could not break. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from sealed court documents, private journals discovered in abandoned homesteads, and testimony given in hushed voices by descendants who still live in those mountains. Before we continue with the story of Newman's Ridge and the men who never came home, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, real mysteries buried by time, don't get told anywhere else. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you are listening from. I want to know how far these forgotten American stories are reaching. Now let us go back to a time when justice wore a different face, and vengeance was measured not in moments, but in generations. The truth of what happened begins not with the disappearances themselves, but with understanding who the Melungeons were, and why their story became one written in blood and silence. Newman's Ridge rises from the Tennessee landscape like the spine of some ancient beast, its forested slopes concealing valleys where even sunlight seems reluctant to linger. In the 1840s, when land-hungry settlers began pushing deeper into the Appalachian wilderness, they encountered communities that defied every assumption they held about race, origin, and belonging. The Melungeons had been there longer than anyone could remember. Families with names like Collins, Gibson, Goins, and Mullins, speaking English with an accent that sounded almost Elizabethan, their skin ranging from olive to bronze, their eyes sometimes startlingly blue or green against dark hair. They were not white by the standards of the day, nor were they enslaved. They were not recognized as Indian, though some claimed Cherokee or Portuguese ancestry. They existed in a liminal space that 19th-century America found intolerable. In a society increasingly obsessed with racial classification, especially as tensions over slavery mounted, the Melungeons represented something dangerous: ambiguity. The community that lived along Newman's Ridge and nearby Blackwater Creek in Hancock County, Tennessee, numbered perhaps 300 souls by 1850. They farmed the steep hillsides, raised livestock, hunted the forest their grandfathers had hunted. They kept largely to themselves, attending their own churches, educating their children in small schoolhouses hidden in the hollows. They were skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, coopers, weavers, and their work was valued even by those who refused to eat at the same table with them. But they owned land, good land. And as white settlement intensified after the Mexican War, as railroads began snaking through Tennessee, as timber companies eyed the virgin forests of the Appalachians, that land became a target. The legal assault began quietly. Melungeon families found their property deeds challenged in court, with judges ruling that people of mixed blood could not legally own property under certain interpretations of Tennessee law. Surveyors redrew boundary lines, often with the backing of wealthy landowners from Knoxville and further east. Families who had farmed the same plots for 3 generations suddenly found themselves trespassing on their own soil. Vardry Collins was 47 years old in 1852 when he lost his 100-acre farm to a legal maneuver he could barely comprehend. The land had been in his family since before Tennessee was even a state. He had the original grant, signed by a territorial governor, but the circuit court judge in Sneedville ruled that the deed was invalid because Collins could not prove he was white. The farm was sold at auction for a fraction of its value to a speculator named Ephraim Dalton, who had connections to the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. Vardry Collins did what he could through legal channels. He traveled to Knoxville, hired a lawyer who took his money and filed motions that went nowhere. He wrote letters to the governor that were never answered. And when Dalton arrived with a dozen men to take possession of the property, Collins gathered his wife and 7 children and watched his home, the cabin his grandfather had built from chestnut logs, burn to the ground. They said Collins started the fire himself rather than let Dalton have the house. Maybe he did. No one was ever charged. The Collins family moved higher into the ridge, building a rough shelter on land too steep and rocky for anyone else to want. Vardry Collins lived another 11 years, dying in 1863 while the Civil War raged through Tennessee. He died of pneumonia, brought on by years of living in inadequate shelter. His wife, Rebecca, followed him 6 months later, but his sons remembered. Zachariah, the eldest, was 19 when they lost the farm. He watched his father diminish year by year, watched the light go out of his mother's eyes. He remembered every detail of that day, the smirk on Ephraim Dalton's face, the names of the men who had enforced the eviction, the way the flames had consumed everything his family had built. And Zachariah Collins was not alone in his remembering. Between 1852 and 1865, while the nation tore itself apart over slavery, at least 40 Melungeon families in Hancock County and neighboring Lee County, Virginia, lost their land through similar legal theft. The Civil War barely touched these remote valleys. Neither Union nor Confederate forces saw much strategic value in the steep ridges, but the war provided cover for even more aggressive land grabs. With county records in chaos and courthouses sometimes changing hands between military occupations, titles were shuffled, deeds went missing, and surveyors redrew maps to favor those with connections and capital. In 1859, a timber company based in Rogersville purchased 30,000 acres in the region, much of it land that Melungeon families had occupied for generations. The company used a combination of legal pressure and outright intimidation. Homes were burned. Livestock was driven off or slaughtered. There were beatings. There was worse. In June of 1861, 17-year-old Sarah Goins was attacked while walking to her family's cabin after visiting a neighbor. 2 men from the timber company's logging camp grabbed her on the forest path. She fought. They were seen dragging her into the trees by a 10-year-old boy who was too terrified to do anything but run home and tell his father. By the time Calvin Goins and 4 other Melungeon men reached the site, Sarah was barely alive. She survived, but she never spoke again. Not a word for the remaining 34 years of her life. The men who attacked her were never arrested. The county sheriff, a man named Porter Hensley who owned shares in the timber company, said there was insufficient evidence. When Calvin Goins tried to file a complaint with the circuit court, he was told that testimony from colored persons was not admissible against white men. Sarah's brother, Isaac Goins, was 14 years old that summer. He sat by her bedside for weeks while she lay broken and silent. He held her hand, while doctors who charged his father everything he had tried to save her mind, along with her body. He watched his father age a decade in a single season, and Isaac Goins remembered. By 1865, when the war finally ended, Newman's Ridge had become a place of long memories and silent rage. The Melungeon community had lost land, dignity, and innocence. They had learned that the law would not protect them, that appeals to justice were futile, that they existed outside the boundaries of the social contract that supposedly governed civilized society. But they had not lost everything. They still had each other. They had their tight kinship networks, their knowledge of the mountains, their ability to move through the forests like shadows. And they had something else, something that would prove more dangerous than any weapon. They had patience. On a cold evening in November 1865, 6 men gathered in a hunting cabin deep in the hollows of Newman's Ridge. The cabin belonged to Zachariah Collins, now 32 years old, married with 3 children of his own. With him were his younger brothers, Thomas and John Collins. Isaac Goins, now 18, was there, as was his cousin, Martin Goins. The sixth man was Daniel Mullins, whose family had lost 200 acres to a fraudulent survey in 1857. They met by firelight, away from their families, away from anyone who might later claim they had heard anything. What was said in that cabin was never written down. But over the following months, other men joined these meetings, always in secret, always in locations that changed from gathering to gathering. Never more than 8 or 9 men at a time. They called themselves nothing. They kept no records. They made no oaths that could be betrayed. But among themselves they understood they were going to take back what had been stolen, and they were going to make sure that those who had destroyed Melungeon families paid a price that could never be adjudicated in any court. What they planned was not random violence. It was not blind vengeance. It was something colder, more deliberate. They would target specific men, those who had profited most directly from Melungeon suffering, those who had participated in the violence, those who had wielded the law like a weapon. They would take these men quietly, leave no evidence, and ensure that the disappearances could never be connected to Newman's Ridge. And they would wait, years, if necessary. Because vengeance, they had learned, was a dish best served with the patience of mountains. The first name on their list was Ephraim Dalton, the man who had taken Vardry Collins' farm and burned his home. Ephraim Dalton prospered in the years after the Civil War. His connections to the railroad and timber interests made him wealthy by the standards of rural Tennessee. By 1872, he owned 4 properties in Hancock County, including the original Collins farm, which he had converted into a profitable cattle operation. He built a fine 2-story house in Sneedville, married a woman from a respectable Knoxville family, and served 2 terms on the county commission. He was 53 years old and had not thought about Vardry Collins in over a decade when he vanished on the night of October 14th, 1872. The evening began ordinarily enough. Dalton had spent the day in Sneedville conducting business. He had recently acquired timber rights to another tract near Powell Mountain and was negotiating contracts with a logging company from Virginia. He dined at the Hancock Hotel with 2 business associates, staying until nearly 9 o'clock. The night was clear and cold, the first real frost of autumn glittering on the ground. Dalton's horse was stabled at the hotel, and he planned to ride the 8 miles back to his house on the Collins property, where his wife and 2 children were waiting. He never arrived. The next morning, when Dalton failed to appear for a scheduled meeting, his business partner rode out to the Dalton house to check on him. His wife said he had never come home. They found Dalton's horse still in the stable at the Hancock Hotel, his saddle and gear undisturbed. His last known location was the hotel itself, from which he had departed on foot around 9:15, intending to walk the short distance to the stable. Sheriff Porter Hensley, the same man who had dismissed Calvin Goins's complaint 11 years earlier, organized a search. They found nothing. No body. No signs of struggle, no blood, no witnesses who had seen anything unusual. Dalton had simply ceased to exist between the hotel door and the stable, a distance of perhaps 100 yards along Sneedville's main street. Theories abounded. Robbery, though nothing was taken, Dalton's wallet containing $70 and several banknotes was found in his hotel room. He had never retrieved it before leaving. An accident. Though no body turned up in any of the likely places a man might fall and die. Foul play related to his business dealings, though no enemies could be identified who would benefit from his death. The investigation lasted 2 weeks before Hensley closed the case as an unexplained disappearance. Dalton's wife inherited his properties. Life moved on. But up on Newman's Ridge, something had changed. There was a stillness in the Melungeon community, a quality of watchful waiting. When word of Dalton's disappearance reached the scattered cabins and farms, people said little. They went about their work. They tended their children. They asked no questions. Only Zachariah Collins, now nearly 40 years old, allowed himself a moment of private satisfaction. He stood on the steep hillside where his family's rough cabin perched, looking down toward the valley where his grandfather's farm had once flourished. He thought about his father, dead these 9 years. He thought about his mother, buried beside him in the small cemetery where Melungeons laid their dead. And he thought about how some debts take a lifetime to repay, but they always come due. The next disappearance came almost 3 years later, in August of 1875. The victim was a man named Tobias Fletcher. Fletcher had been one of the surveyors who redrew property boundaries in the late 1850s, working for the Rogersville Timber Company. His surveys had displaced at least 7 Melungeon families, including the Mullins clan. Fletcher was known for his meticulous work and his complete lack of sympathy for those who lost their land. When asked once by a newspaper reporter how he felt about the families his surveys displaced, he had replied, "I draw lines where the law and mathematics dictate. I am not concerned with who stands on which side of those lines." By 1875, Fletcher had retired from surveying and operated a small general store in Jonesville, Virginia, just across the state line from Hancock County. He was 61 years old, a widower, and lived alone in rooms above his store. He disappeared on a Saturday evening after closing his shop. His body was never found. His store was locked from the inside, his cash drawer untouched, his living quarters showing no signs of disturbance. It was as if Tobias Fletcher had simply been erased from existence. The Lee County Sheriff conducted a brief investigation, but with no evidence of a crime and no body, there was little to pursue. Fletcher had no close family, and few people mourned his passing. The store was sold to settle his debts, and within a year, people had trouble remembering exactly when he had vanished or why anyone had cared. Up on Newman's Ridge, Daniel Mullins planted an apple tree that fall. It was a good tree, grafted from old stock, and it would bear fruit for decades. Mullins never said why he planted it that particular autumn, but he tended it with unusual care, and years later, he would sit beneath its shade and remember the land his family had lost and the man who had drawn the lines that took it away. The disappearances continued, but not with any regular pattern. That was part of what made them so difficult to connect, so easy to dismiss as unrelated incidents across 2 states and multiple counties. Months, sometimes years, would pass between vanishings. The victims seemed to have nothing in common: different ages, different occupations, different towns. But they did have something in common, if anyone had cared to look closely enough. Each man had, at some point between 1850 and 1865, participated in the dispossession or abuse of Melungeon families. Each had prospered from that participation, and each disappeared so completely that not even their bones were ever found. In March of 1878, Benjamin Chadwick vanished while traveling between Kingsport and Rogersville. Chadwick had been a deputy sheriff in the 1850s, known for his enthusiastic enforcement of eviction orders against Melungeon families. He was fond of saying that the Ridge people needed to learn their place or be taught it. In November of 1880, Samuel Pritchard disappeared from his farm near Cumberland Gap. Pritchard had led the logging crew that burned out 3 Melungeon families in 1862, claiming they were squatting on timber company land. One of those families had included a young woman named Martha Collins, Zachariah's cousin. Martha and her 2 children had died the following winter from exposure and starvation. In June of 1883, Leonard Garrett vanished while fishing in the Powell River. Garrett had served as a magistrate in Hancock County during the late 1850s, and he had signed off on dozens of property transfers that stripped Melungeon families of their land. His fishing equipment was found on the riverbank. His body was not. With each disappearance, the investigation followed the same pattern: brief, perfunctory, and ultimately fruitless. Sheriffs and magistrates would make the required inquiries, find no evidence of foul play, and close the cases. If anyone noticed that the victims all had connections to the Melungeon dispossession of decades earlier, they said nothing about it in official reports. But people noticed. In the taverns of Sneedville and Jonesville, in the timber camps and rail yards, men began to whisper. They spoke of retribution, of old wrongs being avenged, of the Ridge people taking back what had been stolen. Some said it was nonsense. The Melungeons were too passive, too beaten down, too scattered to organize anything like systematic revenge. Others were not so sure. They remembered the silence of Newman's Ridge, the way Melungeon men watched without seeming to watch, the way information traveled through those mountains without anyone apparently speaking. And some men, those who had participated in the old land grabs and violence, began to feel the first cold touches of fear. They started locking their doors at night. They traveled in groups. They became careful about who knew their routines and movements, but fear, they would learn, was not the same thing as safety. The architects of the disappearances, for that is what they were, architects, not simple murderers, had learned the lessons of their own persecution. They knew that organization was vulnerability, that records were evidence, that loose talk was betrayal. So they operated without structure, without meetings that could be infiltrated, without any written trace. The method was elegant in its simplicity. A man would be chosen, his habits studied for months or even years. Not by a single watcher who might be noticed, but by the community itself. Melungeon farmers who sold vegetables in town, children who played in the streets, women who cleaned houses and heard conversations. Information flowed back to Newman's Ridge in 100 small streams, none of them individually notable, all of them collectively comprehensive. When the moment came, it was never random. The target would be isolated through circumstance that seemed natural. A road traveled alone, a night spent away from family, a routine that created predictability. 2 or 3 men would move with the silence learned from generations of hunting these mountains. There would be no confrontation, no dramatic accusation, no opportunity for the victim to fight or cry out. And then the most crucial part, disposal. The mountains held countless places where a body might rest undisturbed for decades or centuries. Abandoned mine shafts, limestone caves with underground streams, forest hollows where even deer feared to tread. The men of Newman's Ridge knew these places intimately. They had been hiding their own existence in these mountains for generations. Hiding someone else's death was simply another form of the same skill. Just when we thought we had understood the pattern of these calculated disappearances, something would happen to remind us that vengeance, once unleashed, does not always follow the careful plans of those who invoke it. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens when the line between justice and murder becomes too blurred to see. What happened next would prove that even the most carefully controlled revenge can slip beyond the grasp of those who believe they command it. By 1885, 13 men had disappeared under circumstances that defied explanation. The authorities in eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia had begun to recognize, however reluctantly, that something systematic was occurring. That recognition, however, did not translate into understanding or effective investigation. The problem was evidence, or rather the absolute lack of it. In 13 vanishings spread across 3 counties over 13 years, investigators had found not a single body, not a single witness to violence, not a single physical trace that would indicate foul play. Some of the men had disappeared from their own homes, others had vanished from public spaces in broad daylight. The locations and methods seemed to have no pattern. What the authorities did not know, what they could not know without understanding the deep history of the region, was that every single victim had participated in crimes against Melungeon families. The pattern was there, but it was written in land deeds, court records, and private letters scattered across decades and multiple jurisdictions. No single investigator had access to all the pieces, and even if they had, the social prejudice of the era would have made it difficult to recognize the Melungeons as anything other than a vague, mixed-race population of no particular consequence. But there were a few people who began to see the pattern. One of them was a young lawyer named William Shepherd. Shepherd had grown up in Knoxville and had moved to Rogersville in 1883 to establish his practice. He was 31 years old, ambitious, and intelligent enough to recognize that unusual cases could build a reputation. When the widow of Samuel Pritchard approached him in 1885 about having her husband declared legally dead so she could settle his estate, Shepherd agreed to take the case. In preparing the death declaration, Shepherd had to document the circumstances of Pritchard's disappearance. This led him to review the sheriff's investigation file, which was thin but contained one interesting detail. Pritchard had disappeared shortly after receiving a threatening letter. The letter had been dismissed by investigators as the work of a crank, but Shepherd obtained a copy from Mrs. Pritchard. The letter was short and unsigned. "You took what was not yours to take. You burned what you had no right to burn. Debts unpaid do not disappear, Mr. Pritchard. They merely accumulate interest." Shepherd was intrigued by the phrasing, "You burned what you had no right to burn." It suggested that the writer knew specific details about Pritchard's past. A little research into Pritchard's history revealed his role in the 1862 evictions and burnings in Hancock County. This discovery prompted Shepherd to look at the other disappearances with fresh eyes. He spent weeks traveling to county courthouses, reading through old newspapers, interviewing people who remembered the missing men. A picture began to emerge. Ephraim Dalton acquired multiple properties formerly owned by Melungeons through dubious legal means. Tobias Fletcher, surveyor whose work displaced Melungeon families. Benjamin Chadwick, deputy sheriff who enforced evictions with excessive violence. Leonard Garrett, magistrate who signed off on fraudulent property transfers. The list went on. Not every missing man had such clear connections. Some required deeper digging to uncover their roles in the displacement of Melungeon families, but the pattern was undeniable once Shepherd knew what to look for. In November of 1885, Shepherd took his findings to Judge Marcus Caldwell of the Tennessee Circuit Court. He presented his research in a lengthy memorandum, arguing that the disappearances were connected and represented a systematic campaign of retribution against those who had participated in the persecution of Melungeons decades earlier. Judge Caldwell read the memorandum. He asked Shepherd several penetrating questions, and then he locked the document in his desk drawer and told Shepherd to drop the matter entirely. "Mr. Shepherd," Caldwell said, "you are a young man with a promising future. I would hate to see that future compromised by an ill-advised crusade. These disappearances, tragic as they may be, are unsolved criminal matters, if indeed they are criminal matters at all. Several of the men simply walked away from their lives. Others met with accidents that have yet to be discovered. The connection you have drawn is tenuous at best and potentially libelous at worst." "But, sir," Shepherd protested, "the pattern—" "The pattern," Caldwell interrupted, "is your own construction. You have drawn lines between events that may or may not be related. More importantly, you have identified a potential perpetrator, a population that has already suffered considerably and which has no legal standing to pursue grievances through proper channels. If you make these allegations public, you will be painting a target on an already vulnerable community, and I can assure you that certain powerful interests in this state will not take kindly to accusations that their past business dealings were improper, even if those dealings were with—" He paused, searching for the word. "With people of uncertain racial classification." Shepherd left the meeting frustrated, but not entirely surprised. He understood the reality. Officially investigating his theory would require acknowledging that serious crimes had been committed against Melungeons, which would in turn require recognizing them as a legitimate community with legal rights. That recognition would open questions about land titles, about the validity of decades of property transfers, about whether Tennessee had systematically defrauded an entire population. The economic and legal implications were staggering. It was easier to let the missing men remain missing, to chalk their disappearances up to individual tragedies or mysteries, to avoid asking questions that might overturn settled expectations. But Shepherd was young and idealistic enough to believe that justice mattered more than convenience. He continued his research, now even more determined to understand the full scope of what had happened, and what was, perhaps, still happening. His investigation took him eventually to Newman's Ridge itself. Shepherd was not naive enough to simply ride into the Melungeon community asking questions about murders. Instead, he used the pretext of legal business. Several Melungeon families were attempting to regain title to lands they had lost decades earlier, and Shepherd offered his services at minimal cost to help them navigate the legal system. It was a genuine offer. Shepherd believed the land seizures had been unjust, and he thought that with proper legal representation, some of the original claims might be restored. But it was also a way to gain access to the community, to hear their stories firsthand, to understand what had been done to them. Over the following months, Shepherd became a familiar figure on Newman's Ridge. He visited farms and cabins, took statements, reviewed old deeds and documents that families had preserved. He heard stories that made his blood run cold, not just stories of lost land, but of violence, sexual assault, families torn apart, children who died from exposure after being driven from their homes. And slowly, very slowly, the people of Newman's Ridge began to trust him. One evening in March of 1886, Shepherd was invited to dinner at the home of Thomas Collins, Zachariah's younger brother. The meal was simple but well prepared, and Thomas's wife, Eleanor, proved to be a gracious host. After dinner, Thomas and Shepherd sat on the porch while the sun set over the ridge, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. "You have been asking a lot of questions, Mr. Shepherd," Thomas said quietly. "People have noticed." "I am trying to understand what happened," Shepherd replied. "To help, if I can. Some things cannot be helped by lawyers. Some debts cannot be paid in courtrooms." Shepherd chose his words carefully. "I know that men have disappeared, men who hurt your community. I know that those disappearances have never been solved." Thomas Collins was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the gathering dusk. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old sorrows and older decisions. "My father lost everything because men decided we did not deserve to own land. My mother died in a shack that was not fit for animals. My cousin Martha and her children froze to death after men burned their home for sport. My brother's wife was attacked. She never spoke again after what was done to her. These things happened, Mr. Shepherd. They happened to real people, to families with names and histories and dreams, and no one was ever punished. No one even tried." "I understand," Shepherd said softly. "Do you?" Thomas turned to look at him directly. "Do you understand what it means to watch your father die of a broken heart? To know that the men who destroyed him are prospering? To realize that there is no law, no court, no authority that will ever give you justice?" "No," Shepherd admitted. "I suppose I do not truly understand that. But I understand that what was done to your people was wrong. I understand that the law failed you. I understand that when institutions fail, people find other ways to balance the scales." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "You are asking dangerous questions, Mr. Shepherd. Questions that could lead to answers you might not want to know." "I am not looking to prosecute anyone," Shepherd said. "I am looking to understand, and perhaps to ensure that what happened to your community is never forgotten, even if it cannot be officially acknowledged. And if you discover things, if you come to know things that should remain unknown, then I will keep them to myself. I give you my word." Another long silence fell between them. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and the wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant voices. "My brother Zachariah might be willing to talk to you," Thomas finally said. "He is the one who remembers everything. But you must understand, if he talks to you, it will not be confession. It will not be evidence. It will simply be one man telling another man a story. Do you understand the difference?" "I do." "Then I will speak to him. If he agrees, someone will find you and bring you to a place where you can talk. But Mr. Shepherd, whatever you hear, whatever you come to believe, you must understand that some stones are better left unturned. Not because the truth is shameful, but because the truth is a weapon, and weapons in the wrong hands cause more harm than the original wounds they were meant to avenge." 3 days later, a young Melungeon boy found Shepard in Sneedville and told him that someone wanted to meet him at an old hunting cabin up on the ridge. Shepard followed the boy through the forest for nearly 2 hours, climbing higher into the mountains than he had ever gone before, until they reached a clearing where a small log structure stood surrounded by ancient trees. Zachariah Collins was waiting for him. Zachariah Collins was 53 years old when William Shepard met him in that remote cabin. He was tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair, and eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked upon. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of hard work, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was educated and precise. Whatever else the Melungeons had lost, they had never lost their pride in language and learning. "Mr. Shepard," Zachariah said, gesturing to a rough wooden chair, "my brother tells me you can be trusted. I hope that is true for both our sakes. I will not betray any confidence you share with me," Shepard said, settling into the chair. "Confidence." Zachariah smiled faintly. "An interesting word. It suggests trust, but also secrets. I suppose that is appropriate." He poured 2 cups of water from a clay pitcher. "Tell me, Mr. Shepard, what do you know about justice? I know it is supposed to be blind. I know it is supposed to be equal under law." "Yes, supposed to be. But we both know that theory and practice diverge considerably, particularly when it comes to people like mine." Zachariah drank from his cup. "I was 19 years old when I watched my father lose everything he had built. I watched him try every legal means available to regain what was stolen. I watched him spend the last dollar he possessed on lawyers who filed motions that were never heard by judges who had already decided that people like us had no standing before the law. I watched him die, broken and poor, on land too steep for decent farming, in a shelter that barely kept out the winter wind." "I have heard similar stories," Shepard said carefully. "Have you? How many stories, Mr. Shepard? Can you name 40 families? 50? Because I can. I can tell you their names, their histories, what was taken from them, and who did the taking. I can tell you about children who died from exposure, women who were assaulted, men who were beaten or murdered when they tried to resist. I can tell you these things because I have spent 30 years remembering them, documenting them, ensuring that they would never be forgotten even if they could never be officially acknowledged." Zachariah stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. He opened it and withdrew a leather-bound journal, thick with pages. He placed it on the table between them. "This is a record," he said. "Names, dates, properties, crimes, everything that was done to my people between 1850 and 1865. I have been keeping it since I was 20 years old. Every time I learned of another family dispossessed, another person harmed, I wrote it down. Not for any legal purpose, I had no illusions about the law, but because I believed that truth has value even when it has no power." Shepard opened the journal carefully. The pages were covered in neat handwriting, each entry meticulously dated and detailed. He saw names he recognized: Ephraim Dalton, Tobias Fletcher, Samuel Pritchard, all the men who had disappeared, alongside descriptions of their actions against Melungeon families. "This is extraordinary," Shepard said. "This could be evidence." "Evidence of what?" Zachariah interrupted. "Of crimes that no court would prosecute? Of theft that was sanctioned by the state? Mr. Shepard, that journal is not evidence. It is simply a record of suffering. What you choose to understand from it is your own concern." Shepard continued reading. The entries were devastating in their cumulative detail. Each individual incident might seem minor in isolation, a questionable survey here, a disputed property line there, but together they painted a picture of systematic destruction of an entire community. And then Shepard noticed something else. In the margins of certain entries there were small marks, simple symbols that looked like crosses or check marks. He flipped through the pages and saw that 13 entries bore these marks. Each marked entry corresponded to a man who had disappeared. Shepard's throat went dry. He looked up at Zachariah Collins, who was watching him with an expression that revealed nothing. "I see you have noticed the marks," Zachariah said quietly. "What do they mean?" "They mean that some debts have been paid." Not through courts, not through law, but paid nonetheless. Zachariah sat down across from Shepard. "Let me tell you a story, Mr. Shepard. It is only a story, you understand. Not evidence, not confession. Simply words between two men in a cabin on a mountain." Zachariah spoke for nearly an hour. He described how, in the years after the war, a small group of Melungeon men had made a decision. They had concluded that if the law would not protect them, if society had placed them outside the bounds of justice, then they would create their own form of justice. Not random violence, not blind vengeance, but calculated retribution against those who had most egregiously harmed their community. He described how they had waited, sometimes for years, until the moment was right. How they had studied their targets, learned their routines, identified moments of vulnerability. How they had acted with precision and care, ensuring that no trace would ever lead back to Newman's Ridge. "We were patient," Zachariah said. "Patience was perhaps our greatest weapon. These men thought they had gotten away with their crimes. They grew comfortable. They stopped looking over their shoulders. And that was when we moved." "How many were involved?" Shepard asked. "That is a dangerous question, Mr. Shepard. Let us say only that it was more than one and fewer than you might think. The beauty of our approach was that it required very little organization. A man would be chosen. Information would be gathered. An opportunity would present itself. 2 or 3 people would act. The rest of the community knew nothing specific. They only knew that certain men who had harmed us were no longer in the world." "And the bodies?" Zachariah smiled without humor. "These mountains are old, Mr. Shepard. They hold many secrets. There are places where a man might rest undisturbed until the mountains themselves erode to dust. We know these places. Our grandfathers hunted these ridges. Our fathers hid from those who would harm us in these caves and hollows. We simply used that knowledge for a different purpose." Shepard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the cabin. What Zachariah was describing was perhaps the most carefully executed campaign of serial murder in American history. Not the work of a single killer, but a community acting with collective purpose over decades. "Why are you telling me this?" Shepard asked. "Because someone should know. Because history should record what was done to us and what we did in return. And because—" Zachariah paused, his expression troubled for the first time. "Because I am not certain we can stop." "What do you mean?" "I mean that vengeance has a momentum of its own. We began with clear targets, men whose crimes were undeniable, whose guilt was documented in my journal. But as the years passed, as more men acted, as the circle of those who knew expanded slightly, the criteria became less precise. Grudges that had nothing to do with the original land seizures began to influence decisions. Personal animosities, old insults. The line between justice and simple murder began to blur. Zachariah stood and walked to the cabin's single window, looking out at the darkening forest. 3 years ago, a man named Robert Hutchins disappeared. Hutchins was a merchant in Jonesville. He had no involvement in any of the land seizures. He had never harmed a Melungeon family. But he had gotten into a business dispute with one of our people, and he had said some insulting things about Melungeons in general. He was not on my list. He should not have been touched, but he disappeared nonetheless. Who took him? I do not know. And that is what frightens me, Mr. Shepard. We operated without structure, without hierarchy, specifically to avoid leaving evidence. But that same lack of structure means I cannot control what is done in the name of our community. Others may have taken up the work, people who did not understand the original purpose, who see only the pattern of revenge and wish to continue it for their own reasons. Shepard absorbed this revelation. Are you saying that some of the disappearances may not have been justified? I'm saying that I fear we have created something we cannot control, a tradition of violence that has taken on a life of its own. And I am saying that I do not know how to stop it without exposing us all to prosecution for the actions that were justified. The 2 men sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, night had fully fallen, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. "What do you want from me?" Shepard finally asked. "I want you to know the truth. All of it. The crimes committed against us, and the crimes we committed in return. I want someone outside our community to understand that we were driven to this, that it was not simple savagery but desperate justice. And I want—" Zachariah hesitated. "I want help ensuring that it ends, that no more men disappear, that we can close this chapter of our history without destroying what remains of our people. That will not be easy. Nothing about our existence has been easy, Mr. Shepard." Over the following weeks, Zachariah Collins continued meeting with William Shepard, each time in different locations, always with elaborate precautions to ensure they were not followed or observed. Zachariah shared more details from his journal, fleshed out the stories of specific disappearances, and introduced Shepard to two other men who had been involved in the early actions, Isaac Goins and Daniel Mullins. These men, now in their 40s and 50s, had lived with their secrets for decades. They spoke carefully, always framing their words as hypotheticals or stories, never quite admitting direct participation. But the truth was clear enough. They had been the instruments of retribution, carrying out judgments that no court would render, exacting payments for debts that no law would recognize. And they shared Zachariah's concern. The violence had spread beyond their control. In the past 2 years, 3 more men had disappeared, and none of them appeared in Zachariah's journal of documented crimes. The killings, if that was what they were, seemed to be continuing based on nothing more than rumor, suspicion, or personal grievance. "We need to send a message to our community," Isaac Goins said during one meeting. "We need to make it clear that this is finished, that no more actions will be taken. But how do we do that without revealing what we have done? How do we stop something that operates in shadows without bringing light to those shadows?" It was Daniel Mullins who suggested a solution. "We need someone from outside to solve one of the disappearances. Not all of them. That would expose too much. But one. A recent one. One where the victim was not on our list, where we can honestly say we know nothing about it. If authorities can solve that case, arrest someone, bring them to trial, it might be enough to make people understand that the immunity is over, that there are consequences now." "But who would we sacrifice?" Zachariah asked. "Who could we point investigators toward without implicating the rest of us?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and troubling. The disappearance that would eventually unravel everything happened on a frigid January night in 1889. The victim was a man named Henry Dalton, no relation to Ephraim Dalton, who had vanished 17 years earlier, a schoolteacher from Kingsport who had recently moved to a small town called Ewing, just across the Virginia line from Hancock County. Henry Dalton was 28 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts a decent man. He taught at the local school and was well liked by his students and their families. He had no history with the Melungeons. He had never participated in land seizures or violence. His only connection to Newman's Ridge was that he had recently begun courting a young woman named Rebecca Gibson, whose family lived on the outskirts of the Melungeon community. Rebecca Gibson was 19, intelligent, and beautiful. Her family was Melungeon but relatively prosperous. They had managed to hold onto their land through a combination of luck and strategic family connections. Rebecca's father, Samuel Gibson, was cautiously supportive of her relationship with Henry Dalton, seeing it as a potential bridge between their community and the wider society that had so long rejected them. But not everyone in the Melungeon community viewed the relationship favorably. Some saw it as betrayal, as Rebecca turning her back on her heritage to pursue a white man. Others worried that Dalton would bring unwanted attention to the ridge, that his presence would invite the scrutiny they had worked so hard to avoid. Henry Dalton disappeared on January 19, 1889, while walking from the Gibson home back to his boarding house in Ewing, a distance of about 3 miles along a well-traveled road. He had spent the evening with Rebecca and her family, leaving around 9 o'clock. The night was clear and cold, with a bright moon illuminating the road. He never reached his boarding house. His body was found 4 days later in a shallow ravine about a mile from the Gibson property. Unlike all the previous disappearances, this body was not carefully hidden. It was not placed in a cave or mine shaft where it might never be discovered. It was simply dragged off the road and covered with brush, as if whoever killed him had been in a hurry or had not cared whether he was found. Henry Dalton had been beaten to death. His skull was fractured in multiple places, and his ribs were broken. It had been a savage, prolonged attack, nothing like the clean, efficient disappearances that had characterized the previous 17 vanishings. The Lee County Sheriff, a man named Thomas Crawford, treated this case differently than all the others. For one thing, there was a body, which meant there was indisputable evidence of murder. For another, the victim was a respectable white man with no obvious enemies or involvement in controversial activities. And finally, Crawford was new to his position. He had been elected just the previous year, and he was eager to prove himself capable of solving serious crimes. Crawford interviewed everyone who had seen Dalton that evening. He talked to the Gibson family, who described a pleasant dinner with no tensions or arguments. He talked to other families along the road Dalton would have traveled, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. And he talked to residents of Newman's Ridge, asking pointed questions about their feelings regarding Dalton's relationship with Rebecca Gibson. Most people told Crawford nothing useful. Melungeons had learned long ago that talking to authorities rarely worked in their favor. They answered questions politely but briefly, volunteering nothing beyond what was directly asked. But Crawford was persistent and observant. He noticed that people seemed nervous when he asked about Dalton. He noticed the way conversations would stop when he approached groups of men, and he noticed something else. Several people mentioned almost in passing that there had been arguments in the community about Rebecca Gibson's relationship with the schoolteacher. Crawford began focusing on a young man named Joseph Goins, Isaac's nephew. Joseph was 23 years old, hot-tempered, and had been heard making bitter comments about Rebecca disgracing herself with an outsider. Several witnesses placed Joseph on the road that Dalton would have traveled that night, and when Crawford searched Joseph's cabin, he found a heavy walking stick with what appeared to be bloodstains. Joseph Goins was arrested on January 28, 1889, and charged with the murder of Henry Dalton. The arrest sent shockwaves through Newman's Ridge. Zachariah Collins, when he learned of it, felt a cold dread settle over him. He knew Joseph Goins. The young man was reckless, angry about things that had happened before he was born, eager to prove himself to the older generation that had allegedly settled old scores. Zachariah called an emergency meeting with Isaac, Daniel, and Thomas. They gathered in the same cabin where Zachariah had first spoken to William Shepard, and their conversation was tense. "Did Joseph do this?" Zachariah asked Isaac directly. Isaac Goins looked like he had aged 10 years in the past week. "I do not know. He has been talking for months about taking action, about continuing what he called our tradition. I told him he was a fool, that he understood nothing about what we did, or why we did it. But he would not listen." "Did you tell him about the others? About Dalton and Fletcher and the rest?" "Never directly. But he is not stupid. He grew up hearing whispers, seeing men react when certain names were mentioned. He put pieces together. And now he has murdered an innocent man," Daniel Mullins said bitterly. "A man who had done nothing to us, who was guilty of nothing except falling in love with one of our daughters." "We do not know that Joseph did it," Thomas Collins interjected. "The evidence is circumstantial. The evidence is enough to hang him," Zachariah said flatly. "And when they hang him, they will ask questions. They will want to know why a Melungeon killed a white schoolteacher. They will dig into our history, our grievances, our motivations, and they will find patterns. They will start connecting disappearances that have gone unsolved for 20 years. The men sat in heavy silence, each contemplating the potential unraveling of secrets they had guarded for decades. "We need to talk to Shepard," Zachariah finally said. "He is the only person outside our community who knows the truth." the only one who might be able to help us navigate this without destroying everything. William Shepherd, when Zachariah found him 2 days later, was already aware of Joseph Goins's arrest. The case was generating significant attention across the region. A white schoolteacher murdered, allegedly by a Melungeon, in what some newspapers were already characterizing as racially motivated violence. "This is a disaster," Shepherd said bluntly when they met. "If Goins goes to trial, every prejudice and suspicion about your people will be given official validation. And if prosecutors start looking at motive, if they start researching the history between Melungeons and the surrounding community, they might stumble onto the pattern of disappearances." "Can you represent him?" Zachariah asked. "Me? I am a property lawyer, not a criminal attorney. I have never tried a murder case. But you know the context. You know what has been done to us. You can explain why someone like Joseph might have been driven to violence without revealing what we actually did." Shepherd considered this. Representing Joseph Goins would be professionally risky. Taking on the defense of a Melungeon accused of murdering a white man would not endear him to potential clients or the legal establishment. But Shepherd had spent months learning about the injustices suffered by this community, and he felt a moral obligation to help if he could. "I will do it," he finally said. "But you need to tell me everything Joseph said or did in the months before the murder. I need to understand whether he actually did this, and if so, why." Over the following weeks, as Joseph Goins sat in the Lee County Jail awaiting trial, Shepherd built his defense. He interviewed Joseph extensively and came to a troubling conclusion. Joseph probably had killed Henry Dalton, though he steadfastly refused to confess. The killing had not been planned or methodical like the earlier disappearances. It had been impulsive, emotional, the act of a young man who had romanticized stories of ancestral vengeance without understanding the careful discipline that had guided those earlier actions. Joseph had confronted Dalton on the road. They had argued about Rebecca, and Joseph had lost control. But Shepherd also learned something else. Joseph was not the only young Melungeon who had been inspired by whispered stories of the disappearances. There were others, mostly men in their 20s and 30s, who believed that violence against outsiders was a justified response to historical oppression. They saw the earlier disappearances not as carefully targeted retribution, but as a general license for violence against anyone who threatened or insulted the Melungeon community. This was what Zachariah had feared. The original group had acted with precision and restraint, targeting only those whose crimes were documented and undeniable. But the next generation had absorbed only the fact of violence, not the reasoning behind it. They were turning calculated justice into indiscriminate revenge. The trial of Joseph Goins began on April 15, 1889, in the Lee County Courthouse. The prosecution, led by Commonwealth Attorney Robert Finch, presented a straightforward case. Joseph Goins had murdered Henry Dalton in a fit of rage over Dalton's relationship with Rebecca Gibson. The blood-stained walking stick, witness testimony placing Joseph near the scene, and evidence of Joseph's public hostility toward Dalton were presented efficiently and effectively. Shepherd's defense was more complex. He did not deny that Joseph had been on the road that night or that he had argued with others about Dalton. Instead, he built a case about reasonable doubt and alternative explanations. He pointed out that the bloodstains on the walking stick had never been conclusively proven to be human blood. He noted that multiple people traveled that road regularly, and that Joseph was far from the only person who could have encountered Dalton that night. More significantly, Shepherd introduced historical context. Over the prosecution's objections, he presented evidence of the systematic persecution of Melungeon families over the previous 40 years. He showed land deeds, court records, and testimony from elderly Melungeons describing the violence and theft they had endured. His argument was subtle but powerful. The Melungeon community had been given every reason to distrust and fear outsiders, and while that did not justify violence, it created a context in which tensions could easily escalate. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they found Joseph Goins guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, acknowledging that the killing appeared to have been impulsive rather than premeditated. Joseph was sentenced to 15 years in prison. It was a partial victory. Joseph would not hang, which had been Shepard's primary goal. But 15 years was still a devastating sentence for a young man, and the verdict did nothing to address the deeper problem: the culture of violence that was spreading through the younger generation of Melungeons. 6 months after Joseph Goins's trial, in October of 1889, another man disappeared. His name was Charles Kincaid, and he was a deputy sheriff in Hancock County. Kincaid had no documented history of crimes against Melungeons. He was simply a lawman doing his job, and part of that job had been testifying at Joseph Goins's trial about evidence collection procedures. His disappearance was clean, professional, identical to the pattern of the earlier vanishings. He simply ceased to exist between his office and his home one evening, leaving no trace. Zachariah Collins knew immediately that someone from his original group had acted. The method was too precise, too practiced to be the work of impulsive young men. This was the work of people who had perfected the art of making men disappear. He called another meeting, this time including not just Isaac, Daniel, and Thomas, but also 2 other men who had participated in the earliest disappearances: Martin Goins and Samuel Gibson, Rebecca's father. "Who did this?" Zachariah demanded when they had gathered. "Who took Kincaid?" The men looked at each other uncomfortably. Finally, Martin Goins spoke. "We did. The 4 of us." He gestured to include Daniel, Samuel, and himself. Thomas did not participate and knew nothing about it. "Why?" Zachariah's voice was cold. "Kincaid was not on the list. He had done nothing to warrant this. He sent my nephew to prison," Martin said. "His testimony helped convict Joseph. Joseph was guilty. He murdered an innocent man." "He was one of us," Martin shot back. "And Kincaid helped put him away. That makes him an enemy." Zachariah stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You have learned nothing. Nothing. We did not kill people because they were enemies. We killed them because they had committed specific crimes that would never be prosecuted. We killed them for justice, not revenge. What you did to Kincaid was murder, plain and simple. What we did to all of them was murder," Daniel Mullins said quietly. "Let us not pretend otherwise, Zachariah. You can dress it up in talk of justice and retribution, but we killed 17 men over 20 years. We are not righteous avengers. We are simply killers who had good reasons." The words hung in the air like poison. Zachariah felt something break inside him, some last illusion about the righteousness of what they had done. Daniel was right. They had become the very thing they claimed to oppose. People who placed themselves above the law, who decided who deserved to live and who deserved to die. "It has to stop," Zachariah said. "All of it. No more disappearances, no more revenge. It ends now." "And what about justice for what was done to us?" Samuel Gibson asked. "What about the land that was stolen, the people who were killed, the children who died? Does that just get forgotten?" "No, but we cannot balance those scales with more death. We have become what we hated. We have created a legacy of violence that our children are inheriting, and they are using it without understanding it. Joseph Goins is in prison because he absorbed our violence without absorbing our restraint. How many more young men will follow his path if we do not stop?" Isaac Goins, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Zachariah is right. We have to end this. But how? Some of our people see these disappearances as our heritage, our way of maintaining respect. How do we tell them to stop without explaining what we did?" It was Thomas Collins who proposed the solution, and it was both brilliant and terrifying. "We confess," he said simply. Everyone turned to stare at him. "Not to the authorities," Thomas continued, "but to our community. We call a meeting of every Melungeon family in this region, and we tell them the truth. We tell them what we did, why we did it, and why it must never happen again. We take responsibility for the violence, and we make it clear that this was the action of a few men, not the character of our people. We end the myth that has been building, the idea that killing outsiders is somehow part of our tradition. "They will hate us," Martin said. "They will see us as murderers." "We are murderers," Zachariah said. "And perhaps we deserve their hate, but at least our children will not inherit this burden. At least the killing will stop." The debate continued for hours, but eventually they all agreed. The secret had become too dangerous to keep. It was destroying the next generation, turning justified anger into unjustified violence. The only way to stop the cycle was to end the mystery, to make people understand that what had been done was not glorious revenge, but desperate violence by broken men. The meeting was held on November 3, 1889, in a church on Newman's Ridge. More than 200 Melungeons attended, entire families from elderly grandparents to children. William Shepherd was there as well, having been invited by Zachariah as the only outsider who would understand the full context. Zachariah Collins stood before his community and confessed to 18 murders. He read from his journal, detailing each victim and their crimes against Melungeon families. He explained the careful deliberation, the patience, the precision with which they had acted. He introduced Isaac, Daniel, Martin, Samuel, and 3 other men who had participated in various disappearances, and each confirmed their role. The reaction was complex. Some people were horrified. Others were grateful, seeing the confessors as heroes who had avenged wrongs that no court would acknowledge. Still others were simply shocked, having never truly believed the whispered stories were real. But when Zachariah explained how the violence had corrupted the next generation, how Joseph Goins was sitting in prison because he had followed their example without understanding their restraint, the mood shifted. Parents looked at their children and saw the danger clearly. The romantic notion of ancestral vengeance gave way to the grim reality of endless cycles of violence. Zachariah ended his confession with a plea. "What was done cannot be undone, but it can end with us. Let us be the last generation of Melungeons who responds to injustice with death. Let our children find better ways, legal ways, to seek the justice we were denied. Let this burden die with us." The community debated for hours. Eventually, a consensus emerged. The killings would stop. Anyone who attempted further violence would be turned over to authorities, regardless of their reasoning. The Melungeon people would seek justice through law, through documentation, through the slow work of changing minds and systems. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply an agreement to choose a different path forward. William Shepherd kept his word. He never revealed what he had learned to authorities. The confessions made in that church remained within the Melungeon community, a shared burden that would be passed down through generations as a warning rather than a source of pride. Charles Kincaid's disappearance was never solved. Neither were any of the others. Official records show 18 unexplained vanishings in eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia between 1872 and 1889. All of men with connections to the Melungeon dispossession of the 1850s and 1860s. Various theories were proposed over the years: organized crime, a serial killer, accidents in the wilderness, but no prosecution was ever brought. Zachariah Collins lived another 14 years, dying in 1903 at the age of 70. His journal, which documented both the crimes against his people and the crimes committed in response, was passed to his eldest son with instructions that it never be destroyed, but also never be made public. The journal still exists, held by Collins' descendants, and historians who have been allowed to examine it confirm the details of the land seizures and violence against Melungeon families. The portions detailing the disappearances are written in a personal shorthand that has never been definitively decoded. Isaac Goins died in 1911. Daniel Mullins in 1908, Thomas Collins in 1919. Each man took his specific knowledge to the grave, leaving only fragments and implications for historians to puzzle over. Joseph Goins served 12 years of his 15-year sentence before being released in 1901. He returned to Newman's Ridge, married, and lived quietly until his death in 1934. He never spoke publicly about the murder of Henry Dalton or the circumstances that led to it. Rebecca Gibson never married. She devoted her life to teaching Melungeon children, opening a small school on Newman's Ridge that operated for 37 years. She died in 1947, surrounded by former students who remembered her as stern but loving, a woman who had somehow transmuted personal tragedy into purpose. The Melungeon community slowly changed over the following decades. Some families moved away, seeking opportunities in cities where their ambiguous racial status might be less of a hindrance. Others stayed in the mountains, gradually integrating into the surrounding society as racial attitudes slowly, very slowly evolved. Land disputes continued, but they were increasingly fought in courtrooms rather than through violence. William Shepard became one of the most respected attorneys in eastern Tennessee, though he never took another criminal case after defending Joseph Goins. He specialized in property law and quietly worked on behalf of Melungeon families attempting to reclaim or preserve their land. He died in 1932, and in his will, he left a sealed document to be opened 50 years after his death. When that document was opened in 1982, it contained a detailed account of his meetings with Zachariah Collins and the confessions he had witnessed. It also contained his legal opinion that the disappearances constituted justifiable homicide under the circumstances, though he acknowledged no court of his era would have agreed. The truth about Newman's Ridge remains contested. Some historians argue that the disappearances were unrelated incidents inflated into a conspiracy theory by people seeking to romanticize Melungeon history. Others believe the confessions were real and that the Melungeon community harbored one of America's most successful revenge campaigns. What is undeniable is this. Between 1850 and 1865, Melungeon families in Hancock County and surrounding areas were systematically dispossessed of their land through legal manipulation and violence. And between 1872 and 1889, men who had participated in that dispossession disappeared under circumstances that were never explained. Whether those facts are connected depends on how willing you are to believe that desperate people, denied justice by every legitimate institution, might create their own justice in the shadows. The mountains of eastern Tennessee still hold their secrets. Newman's Ridge still rises above Hancock County, its forests and hollows as impenetrable now as they were a century and a half ago. And somewhere in those mountains, in caves known only to a few, in mine shafts long since collapsed, rest the bones of men whose names are remembered only in private journals and family stories, passed down in whispered voices. This mystery shows us that justice and vengeance are not always easily distinguished, that oppression can drive even peaceful people to desperate acts, and that violence, once started, develops a momentum that outlives the reasons for its creation. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Were the Melungeons justified in their actions, or did they become the very monsters they claimed to oppose? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.